The summer night air in Wardak province, Afghanistan hung thick and oppressive in 2019. Staff Sergeant Charles Bowen and Sergeant Abel adjusted their gear as the helicopters carried them toward their target. They were combat medics with Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Tonight was supposed to be routine, a high-value target operation. Get in, neutralize the threat, get out. But in Afghanistan, nothing ever stayed routine for long. The Black Hawks touched down some distance from the objective, their rotors whipping up clouds of dust that glowed ghostly white in the infrared goggles of the assault force. The Rangers moved through the darkness like shadows, their boots crunching softly on the rocky terrain. In the distance, a compound stood silhouetted against the starlit sky. Intelligence suggested enemy fighters were barricaded inside. The Rangers began their approach, weapons at the ready, each man knowing his role, trusting the men beside him with his life. Bowen and Abel stayed close to the main assault element. As medics, they carried more than just rifles. Their aid bags were stuffed with tourniquets, chest seals, needle decompression kits, intravenous equipment, and precious units of blood. Each medic carried 2 units. In the Ranger Regiment, medics weren't just lifesavers. They were fighters too. They'd go where the casualties were, no matter how hot the zone. The first shots rang out like thunder splitting the night. Muzzle flashes erupted from the compound. AK-47 rounds cracked through the air, followed by the deeper, heavier bursts of PK machine guns. The Rangers returned fire, their M4 carbines barking in controlled bursts. They moved forward, using every bit of cover, every shadow, advancing on the building where the enemy had dug in. Then came the explosion. A massive blast ripped through the night, the shock waves slamming into the Rangers like an invisible fist. The flash was blinding, even through their night vision. When the dust cleared and the ringing in their ears subsided, 3 Rangers were down, wounded, bleeding, and the firefight was far from over. The calls for medic cut through the chaos of gunfire and shouting. Bowen and Abel didn't hesitate. They sprinted toward the blast site, bullets whipping past them, pinging off stone walls just meters away. Enemy rounds kicked up dirt at their feet. Grenades exploded in the distance, but they kept moving. Their brothers needed them. They reached the casualties. One Ranger was conscious, shouting that he was hit, but Bowen quickly assessed him and determined he could walk. He directed him to move to safety and get evaluated. The second casualty was a different story. He lay in the open courtyard, twisted in an unnatural position, conscious but clearly in agony. The enemy fire was relentless, but Bowen didn't think twice. He ran into the open, grabbed a wounded Ranger, and dragged him behind the only cover available, a small mound of earth barely a meter high. Behind that inadequate cover, with bullets cracking overhead, Bowen went to work. His hands moved with practiced precision despite the chaos around him. The Ranger had a sucking chest wound. Air was being pulled into his chest cavity with every breath, collapsing his lung. Bowen reached for his aid bag, pulled out a needle chest decompression kit, jabbed it into the Ranger's chest to relieve the pressure, then secured an intravenous line and administered tranexamic acid to slow the bleeding. He wrapped tourniquets around the man's right arm and right leg, then secured a junctional tourniquet around his pelvis where blood was pooling from shrapnel wounds. Abel was treating the other casualties from the initial blast, working with the same intensity. Rangers who were certified as advanced Ranger first responders, the regiment's equivalent of emergency medical technicians, jumped in to help. But the fight wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was intensifying. Bowen and another Ranger began dragging the critically wounded man through a dusty corridor, trying to get him to a safer position. Every meter felt like a mile. The enemy could see them moving. Rounds impacted all around them, sending chips of stone and clouds of dust into the air. They finally got him through the breach and established a casualty collection point. But the collection point wasn't safe either. Within moments of arriving, a Taliban fragmentation grenade landed 15 meters away. The explosion sent shrapnel and debris flying. Smoke filled the air. The concussion left their ears ringing. Nearby, other Rangers were on their radios, calling in fire missions. Apache gunships were circling overhead, their 30mm cannons ready to rain hell on enemy positions. Rangers launched grenades toward hardpoints where enemy fighters were entrenched. Abel continued stabilizing the wounded man with the chest wound, while Bowen looked up to see another casualty staggering toward them from the woodline. This Ranger, a canine handler, had blood gushing from the left side of his neck. His military working dog, still attached to his belt by the lead, limped beside him. The handler fell into Bowen, barely able to speak. "Put pressure on the wound," Bowen told him. The Ranger tried, his hand shaking, blood pouring between his fingers. "I'm trying," he gasped. Bowen immediately placed his middle finger directly into the hole in the Ranger's neck, applying direct pressure to stop the hemorrhaging. With his other hand, he grabbed his medical equipment. The wound had caused a massive hemorrhage that was obstructing the Ranger's airway. He was drowning in his own blood. There was no time to waste. Still under fire, with machine gun rounds hitting their position and mortar landing dangerously close, Bowen and Abel made a critical decision. They would perform a cricothyroidotomy, right here, right now, in the dirt, under enemy fire. Bowen positioned the wounded handler while Abel prepared the instruments. The procedure required them to make an incision through the skin and cricothyroid membrane to establish a patent airway. One wrong move, one slip of the blade, and they could kill him. But without it, he would die anyway. Bowen's hands were steady. Years of training took over. He made the incision. Blood welled up, but he worked quickly, inserting a tube to allow air to flow directly into the Ranger's lungs, bypassing the damaged airway. The handler gasped, air rushing into his lungs. He would live. For now. But the crisis wasn't over. Bowen turned his attention back to the Ranger with the chest wound. The man was bleeding out. Despite all the interventions, all the tourniquets, all the pressure dressings, he was losing blood faster than his body could compensate. Abel checked on another casualty who had multiple limb and chest wounds. He too was hemorrhaging badly. Bowen and Abel looked at each other. They both knew what the problem was. These men needed blood. But the medics had already used all the blood units they brought with them, treating the other casualties. They were out. And without fresh blood, these Rangers would die right here in the Afghan dirt. This was the moment that would make history. Bowen and Abel had been trained in a new protocol, something that had never been attempted in combat before. It was called the Ranger O-Low Titre protocol, ROLO for short. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of relying solely on prepackaged blood units, combat medics could draw blood directly from other soldiers in the field and transfuse it immediately into the wounded. The Rangers had been preparing for this. Every platoon had volunteers who had been pre-screened and identified as having type O blood, the universal donor type. These volunteers carried special blood donor packs in their gear. They were ready to give their blood to save their brothers. But this had never been done under fire. Never in the middle of a full-scale firefight. Never when mortar were landing 30 meters away and Hellfire missiles were being called in at danger close range. Bowen made the call. They would do it, they had to. 3 Ranger volunteers came forward without hesitation. While explosions rocked the ground around them, while 30mm cannon fire from circling Apache helicopters shredded enemy positions less than 100 meters away, while 105mm rounds from a C-130 gunships thundered down with earth-shaking force, Bowen and Abel went to work. They lay prone in the dirt. Enemy fighters were still engaging them from less than 100 meters away. Small arms fire cracked overhead. The medics worked by feel as much as by sight, their headlamps casting small pools of light in the darkness. They inserted needles into the arms of the volunteers, watching as blood flowed into the collection bags. The donor Rangers gritted their teeth but didn't complain. 3 pints of blood, drawn in minutes. Each donor knew that giving this blood might leave them weakened, but they didn't care. Their brothers needed it. As soon as the blood was collected, Bowen and Abel began the transfusions. They inserted 4 lines into the critically wounded Rangers, hung the fresh blood bags, and watched as the life-giving fluid flowed into their brothers' veins. The whole procedure was done under continuous fire. Abel and Bowen positioned their own bodies to shield the casualties from harm. When large munitions impacted close by, they covered the wounded men's ears to protect them from the devastating concussion. The blood worked. Color began returning to the faces of the wounded Rangers. Their vital signs stabilized. They would make it. The revolutionary procedure had worked. Combat history had just been made. But the night wasn't over. 4 more wounded Rangers came into the casualty collection point. Bowen and Abel treated each one, performing triage, administering aid, directing other Rangers on how to help. In total, they would save 6 American lives that night. When the enemy threat was finally neutralized and the medevac helicopters arrived, Bowen and Abel helped load every single casualty onto the birds. Only then, after every wounded Ranger was secure, did they pick up their rifles and provide covering fire as the Chinooks lifted off into the night sky, carrying their brothers to safety. The 3 Rangers who had donated their blood, they went right back into the fight. Weakened but determined, they continued the mission until it was complete. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Knight, the 75th Ranger Regiment command surgeon, would later say that what Bowen and Abel accomplished that night was some of the most impressive combat medicine he had ever witnessed. They had ignored their own survival instincts and concentrated solely on their patients. They displayed the highest levels of courage, repeatedly placing their patients' survival above their own safety. They worked with surgical precision while lying in the dirt under enemy fire. They made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. And they succeeded. The Ranger O-Low Titre protocol that Bowen and Abel pioneered that night in Wardak province has since been adopted across the special operations community. It has saved countless lives. But it all started with 2 medics who refused to let their brothers die, 3 volunteers who gave their blood without hesitation, and a unit that trained every single day to be ready for the moment when everything went wrong. The Ranger Creed states, "I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy, and under no circumstances will I ever embarrass my country." That night in Afghanistan, in the summer of 2019, Staff Sergeant Charles Bowen and Sergeant Ty Abel lived those words. They didn't just save lives. They showed the world what it means to be a Ranger, what it means to be a brother, what it means to put others before yourself when it matters most. All 6 Rangers who were critically wounded that night survived. They went home to their families. They recovered. They lived. Because 2 medics refused to accept defeat. Because 3 volunteers gave their blood. Because a regiment trained harder than anyone else in the world. Because in the darkest moment, in the middle of chaos and violence and death, these men chose courage. They chose sacrifice. They chose brotherhood. That is the story of one night in Afghanistan, one firefight among thousands. But it's also a story that will be remembered forever. A story of innovation under pressure. A story of medical heroism. A story that proves when everything is on the line, when the bullets are flying and the bombs are falling, ordinary men can do extraordinary things. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for each other, for the brother fighting beside them, for the soldier bleeding in the dirt, for the oath they took and the creed they lived by. Rangers lead the way. And on that hot summer night in Wardak province, 2 combat medics showed the world exactly what that means.